you're like me and you love working on your motorhome, you're always looking for a new project. Well, this particular project I put off for quite some time because I didn't have a solution for it. The generator in this motorhome is a pull-out generator on a slide in the front, like many are equipped. However, this is a manual slide. You have to unlatch it and then slide it out. The problem is this generator is heavy. The whole assembly is heavy. Now, it's on a good set of rollers, so it does roll out. When you're camped somewhere and the airbags in the motorhome are deflated, the motorhome sits low. The handle to pull out on the tray is very low and it's a poor angle from which to pull, so it's somewhat difficult to get it rolling. But there's another problem with this design that really concerns me, and it's really what pushed me over the edge into trying to come up with a solution. When this was designed, nobody thought to attach any handles to the frame to pull the slide out. You have to actually grab underneath the tray, the front of the motorhome, on the fiberglass to pull the slide out tray out. This fiberglass front end is only held onto these metal channels with one little screw on each side and some epoxy holding the fiberglass to the metal channels. So I went online to rvforum.net to look for a solution to my problem, and somebody actually had a pretty good idea. They suggested that I use a linear actuator to electronically move this generator in and out instead of having to manually pull on it and to pull on the fiberglass. That was my biggest concern, was that I might actually pull the fiberglass front end right off the metal brackets that it's mounted to. One of the first things I had to do was to try to figure out, first of all, how big a linear actuator do I need? How much push-pull force does it need? And how much room do I have to install it? I determined that I could mount a linear actuator inside the frame rail itself. It extends almost all the way out to the front of the motorhome, and it's basically an open channel for several feet going straight back. It's almost ideally suited for mounting an actuator. So this is what we're going to install, a linear actuator. This is a pretty heavy-duty actuator. It's probably overkill, but I'd rather have something that's overpowered than underpowered so the components don't get stressed. This is a Progressive Automation's linear actuator. It runs off of 12 volts. It's got a push-pull rating of 850 pounds when it's operating. It has a 20-inch throw, which means this part will extend 20 inches when it's fully extended. I determined that I needed to put it on this side, the passenger side of the generator, because on the other side there's an access door for the generator for service. Another thing that I was going to have to deal with is, what is the actuator going to push and pull on to push the generator out and pull it back in? It's got to be something fairly heavy duty. Ideally, I'd like to have it down on this lower metal slide tray bracket because this is some pretty heavy steel. But the angle wouldn't allow that, so I had to fabricate a bracket. Okay, this is the bracket that I fabricated, and it mounts to both the top and the bottom of the steel plates, the steel bars that are already used to hold the generator on the slide tray. Okay, we've got our steel bracket installed now, and this is what the actuator is actually going to push and pull on to move the generator in and out. It's important to point out that this is not a randomly positioned bracket. Careful measurements were taken to make sure that this is in the correct fore and aft position so that when the actuator is fully closed, that the generator is fully closed. Okay, here's the fun part. We're actually underneath the motorhome, directly under the generator compartment with the generator slid all the way out, so I have some room to work. There's going to be a lot of, this is not a new motorhome, so there's a lot of dirt up in here and it can come down in your eyes, so make sure when you're working around this kind of stuff you're using safety glasses. We're also going to be drilling to mount the actuator, and that's going to throw some metal shavings down on us, so just be careful. The green is the rear of the generator, and this is the frame rail on the right side here. And you can see how the actuator fits snugly right in here, and it will mount right back in here up against this metal plate. Once I've drilled a hole through here to mate up with the hole in the back of the actuator, we'll slip a bolt through there and it'll hold this actuator firmly in place. I've got the hole drilled, and it's kind of hard to see, but right down in here I put a piece of neoprene rubber, very thin neoprene rubber down, so that as this metal housing lives the rest of its life, it won't have to bang up against this steel frame rail. At least the neoprene will give it a little bit of padding, because there's a whole bunch of little gears in this housing where the motor and the gear ratios are to extend and retract the actuator. So now we're going to slide the actuator into position and put the bolt in the hole. Okay, the linear actuator is installed inside the frame rail now, and it's held very strongly in place through its eye bolt with this bolt right here, all the way through this steel plate up to the other side of the frame rail. It is not going anywhere fore, aft, left, or right. It's almost like this was designed to have this actuator installed here. So now we're going to bring the generator all the way in to make sure, double check our clearances, and this is looking forward on the right side of the generator, and we're going to make sure that the actuator, the attachment bolt up front, hooks up to the steel bracket that we put in place. This is the front part, the push-pull part of the linear actuator, and as you can see, it comes right out of the end of the frame rail on the motorhome. This is the part that will extend out and hook up to that bracket we mounted. When I bought the actuator, I also bought this very nice, very well forged, it looks like aluminum or CNC'd aluminum bracket that will mount to here, and then this will mount to the bracket. Okay, as you can see, this is the bracket that mounts to the front of the linear actuator, and this metal bracket, the black one here, is where it will mount to. There's a little bit of play, which is perfect because we can shim this with a couple of washers to get the length just right, because remember, the most important position is the closed position for the actuator to make sure that the generator will close all the way. We've got our bracket hooked up. We've got our first hole drilled in our steel bracket that we're going to mount that to. So that we've got more room to work, we're going to run the linear actuator out to its full open position. We don't have the whole thing hooked up to the motorhome's power, so we're going to use this 12-volt power supply. It's only got 2 amps, so it'll probably power the actuator in and out, but I doubt it will power it with a load. So let's see how it goes. We'll just let the actuator come all the way out, and when it stops on its own, it's got its own limit switch. We'll position the generator slides so that with a couple of washers for shims, so it's spaced properly, and then we'll retract it and see how well it works. While it's on the way out, you can see that I had to disable the secondary safety latch down here. I did it simply by lifting up on the safety latch like you normally would to release it, then tying it tight with a hose clamp so it can't go back down into position and lock. I also had to disconnect the generator release handle so it wouldn't hold the generator closed. Now I'm going to lose about 1 inch of travel on my generator slide-out tray, and that's because it pulls out to 21 inches, but the throw on the linear actuator, as you can see, is slightly short of that at 20 inches. So I'll put a couple of washers in here for spacers, and then I'll line up the hole. Looks pretty well lined up, and we'll tighten everything up. Okay, we've got the first bolt in, and we've checked the spacing. It looks good. And now we're going to put the second, we drilled the hole, and we're going to put the second bolt in. Well, fortunately, we've got a 12-volt bus right here in our electrical bay just alongside the generator. So this is where we'll install our switch, our fuse or circuit breaker, whatever we decide to use, and our wiring. Now we're going to use pretty heavy-duty wiring, 10-gauge wire, because it is a fairly high amperage system to run a linear actuator. Okay, we've run the wires underneath the motorhome from the linear actuator to the electrical bay, and on the entire route we've used this insulation material. It's fireproof, it protects from chafing, and it really helps keep the elements off the wires. I highly recommend you use it. After drilling a hole in the metal wall of the electrical bay, we installed a PVC fitting and ran the wires through that. That fitting will protect the wires from chafing. I installed the switch that will power the slide out inside this housing. You just lift it up and the switch is right here. It's a momentary switch, so you'll have to hold it down to power the slide out. Wiring the switch itself was actually very simple because there's only 2 wires coming from the actuator. So all you've got to do is reverse the polarity on both sides of the switch to make it extend and retract. This is the circuit breaker panel, and all we had to do was install one more circuit breaker in the back of this panel. Okay, we're all done. I've closed up the electrical panel and it works pretty well. So let's take a look. Reached the end of its travel, its limiting switch shut it off, and it might be hard for you to see, but it is perfectly aligned with the seams. All the way across, it's level, there was no binding, it's perfectly aligned over here. It works pretty well. I'm very happy with it. Well, that's it. If you're planning on doing a project like this on your own, I'm not representing that this is the only way to do it, but this does work very well, so good luck.